Tell me, whose child is she? My mother-in-law slammed a piece of paper on the coffee table, glaring at me. Confused, I picked it up. It was a paternity test report. The test was between my mother-in-law and my daughter, and it showed that they had no biological relationship. I was stunned. This couldn't be right. My daughter is Jack's. I haven't been with any other man. Jack is my husband, my mother-in-law's son. We fell in love freely. He was my first love, and I've only ever been with him. How could our child not be his? Are you still denying it? My mother-in-law fumed. Anyone can see that the child looks nothing like Jack. Now we have the paternity test results, and you still want to deny it? I was furious. How does she not look like Jack? Look closely. I don't need to look. She looks nothing like Jack when he was little. The neighbors have mentioned it to me so many times. They say nice things like, "Your granddaughter is so pretty." But what they really mean is she doesn't look like my son. I don't need a pretty granddaughter. I need my son's own flesh and blood. I was shaking with anger. How is she not your son's child? Ask your son. My son has been completely bewitched by you. He protects you no matter what and listens to everything you say. What's the point of asking him? My 4-year-old daughter saw us arguing and called out to me. My mother-in-law pushed her away and yelled, "Don't call me grandma. I'm not your grandma." My daughter started crying, and I quickly picked her up, furious. If you don't believe she's Jack's child, then tell him to divorce me. I'll move out right now. What? Feeling guilty? My mother-in-law blocked my way. Do you think moving out will solve everything? We've raised a child that's not ours for 4 years. You need to compensate us for all our losses. Listening to my daughter being called an illegitimate child by her own grandmother made me explode with anger. I immediately called Jack. Come home and do the math. See how much you've spent raising our daughter these 4 years. I'll pay you back every cent. Jack was baffled. What are you talking about? Honey, what's going on? Ask your mom, I said, hanging up the phone and heading back to pack my bags. Both Jack and I are pretty average looking. He's not particularly handsome, and I'm not particularly beautiful. We're just like millions of other ordinary people. But our daughter stands out among other kids. Since she was about a year old, everyone who saw her would say, "This child really has the best of both of you." Some would even joke, "How come your daughter looks nothing like you?" I'd laugh and say, "As long as she's better looking than me, it's fine." So it wasn't just that people said she didn't look like my husband. They said she didn't look like me either. But Jack and I had looked closely and noticed that she did resemble us in the details. Jack would joke, "I look like the budget version of our daughter." I'd laugh and say, "Me too." We were proud that 2 ordinary people like us had such a beautiful daughter. But my mother-in-law was always suspicious. Every time she took our daughter out for a walk, she'd come back saying how other kids look like their grandmothers, but her granddaughter didn't look like her at all. The prettier our daughter got, the more suspicious my mother-in-law became. She often hinted to my husband, "Everyone says the child doesn't look like you. Shouldn't you get a paternity test?" My husband would say, "Why would I need a paternity test? I know she's my child." I never expected my mother-in-law to secretly get a paternity test done, and the results showed that my daughter wasn't biologically related to her. What was going on? I suspected the report was fake and that my mother-in-law's goal was to drive me and my daughter away. Just then, Jack came home. My mother-in-law handed him the report. "I let you marry her because she seemed honest and plain-looking, not the type to attract attention. I never thought an honest person could do something like this. If I had known, I would have let you marry your ex." She was referring to Jack's first girlfriend. Jack was my first boyfriend, but I wasn't his. Before he met me, he had a girlfriend who was very beautiful. They were in love for years, but my mother-in-law opposed the relationship, saying, "A woman that beautiful can't be kept. She'll cheat on you for sure." She even threatened to kill herself to break them up and verbally abused the girl. Unable to take it, the girl left Jack. He was devastated and later told me that he had considered suicide several times during that period, but pulled through because he didn't want the girl to feel guilty. Jack and I met through a blind date arranged by my mother-in-law. She had noticed me first and asked our mutual teacher to introduce us. Jack and I were both students of the same teacher, though he was 3 years older than me. Even after graduation, I kept in touch with this teacher. So when she told me she thought she had a student who would be a good match for me, I agreed to meet him. When I first met Jack on our blind date, he made a good impression on me and we started dating. He gradually moved on from his past relationship. After we got married, my mother-in-law was initially kind to me, but her attitude changed after I gave birth to our daughter. She became suspicious and constantly said our daughter didn't look like Jack. Suddenly, I heard Jack shouting, "Are you regretting it now? It's too late for that. You just like to stir up trouble, don't you? You won't be happy until you tear this family apart, right?" My mother-in-law retorted, "What do you mean, tear apart? You've been raising someone else's child for years. Shouldn't I help you find out the truth?" "Did I ask you to find the truth for me? The truth is, she's my biological daughter." My mother-in-law, exasperated, said, "The paternity test results are out. She has no biological relation to me. How can you still say she's your daughter? You're delusional." "Paternity test results?" Jack sneered. "Can you swear that they're real? You just can't stand that we had a daughter. So you cooked up this nonsense to drive my wife and daughter away, hoping I'd marry someone else. This is my only daughter, and I won't have another child." I listened quietly, realizing that Jack and I were on the same page. It seemed there was indeed something wrong with the paternity test report. My mother-in-law got even more agitated. "You think it's fake? I swear, if this paternity test report is fake, I'll get hit by a car the moment I step outside." My heart skipped a beat. Even though I'm not superstitious, hearing such a curse made me uncomfortable. After all, my mother-in-law is Jack's mother. If something really happened to her, Jack would be devastated. Jack was silent for a while, then said gruffly, "Paternity test reports aren't always accurate. If it's not from a reputable institution, there's a high chance of error." My mother-in-law shot back, "You still don't believe it? Then go get a paternity test yourself. If you think the one I got isn't legitimate, find a reputable place." Jack didn't respond to her and went straight to the bedroom. "Daddy," our daughter called out to him. He picked her up, gently patting her back, and said, "Don't be scared. Daddy's here." Then he reassured me, "Don't listen to Mom. We know the truth." I interrupted him. "Let's just get a paternity test done. I don't want to carry this burden of doubt." He thought for a moment and said, "All right, let's do it. Let's show Mom how wrong she is." The next morning, we took our daughter to a paternity testing center. Afterward, I took our daughter to my parents' house. I didn't tell them about the conflict with my mother-in-law, just that we were visiting for a few days. I didn't want them to worry. A few days later, Jack came to pick us up. He whispered to me, "The test results are in. She's my biological daughter." I felt vindicated and was eager to see what my mother-in-law would say now. When we got back, Jack asked his mom, "Mom, is the paternity test report you got real?" "Of course it's real. I swore on it. You still don't believe me? Then am I your biological son?" "What kind of nonsense are you talking about?" My mother-in-law was furious. "I carried you for 10 months and almost died giving birth to you. How can you ask such a stupid question?" "Then take a look at this," Jack said, placing the paternity test report in front of his mom. She picked it up, looked at it, then at our daughter's face, and finally at Jack. "This report must be fake," she declared. I was exasperated. "Mom, you've convinced yourself that she's not your granddaughter, so even if it's written here, you just won't accept it. You doubted my paternity test report, so why can't I doubt yours?" his mom asked. "What will it take for you to believe it's real?" Jack asked. "Have her grandfather do a paternity test with her," his mom said, clearly frustrated. "Mom, you're being crazy." Jack said, "Crazy? I'm doing this for your own good. I just want to get to the bottom of this," she insisted. Jack was about to argue further, but I stopped him. "I agree to have our daughter do a paternity test with her grandfather, but I have one condition." His mom asked, "What condition?" "I want Jack to do a paternity test with his dad." She was taken aback. "What do you mean? Are you suggesting Jack isn't his father's biological son? Why can't I question it?" I countered. This is outrageous," she stammered, too angry to speak. I said, "You think you're above suspicion and you see me as an unfaithful woman, but I believe I'm innocent, so why can't I question your fidelity?" After all, you've been separated from Dad for years. We're separated because of personality differences. I've never done anything to betray him. If I were unfaithful, may I be struck by lightning, she swore again. This time, I wasn't as affected by her curse. Her constant accusations had eroded any goodwill I had left for her. I can swear the same, but does it matter? You believed the paternity test at first, but now you don't. Why? Because Jack is right. You want to drive us away. If she's my granddaughter, of course, I'll love her, she said. Fine, I replied. If you doubt this paternity test, then take them for another one. If it proves my daughter is Jack's, I want you to apologize to her. And if she's not, she challenged. If she's not, I'll leave with my daughter and compensate you for 4 years of child support. You said it, Jack interjected. Let's do another paternity test. Call Dad over. My father-in-law and mother-in-law had a strained relationship and had been living separately for years. He had his own place while she lived with us. In my eyes, my father-in-law was a kind man who never bothered us. He was always cheerful when we visited and treated our daughter well. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, was domineering and constantly criticized him. Whenever we visited him, she would complain that he hadn't contributed to the family and that she had raised Jack on her own, implying we shouldn't visit him. But Jack told me that his father had always been the one providing for the family, and his mother would argue with him over trivial, long-past issues. I called my father-in-law and asked him to come over, without mentioning the paternity test. In all the years since our marriage, I had never asked him for anything. This was the first time, and he agreed without hesitation. Since we lived in the same city, he arrived quickly. When I explained that my mother-in-law doubted our daughter was Jack's, he scolded her. You've never had a peaceful day in your life, always suspicious. Aren't you tired? She insisted on the paternity test, and I also wanted both my daughter and Jack to be tested with him. He agreed, but looked at her with sadness. Hon, you'll regret this. She sneered. What will I regret? I just want to understand why my granddaughter doesn't look like me and isn't biologically related to me. We went to the paternity testing center and did 3 tests, one for my daughter and Jack, one for my daughter and her grandfather, and one for Jack and his father. As we left the center, my father-in-law said to me, I'm sorry you had to go through this. My mother-in-law shouted, She's the one who's wronged. What about me? I'm still your wife? Have you cared about me all these years? Do you even love me? My father-in-law didn't want to argue and left. I didn't want to stay under the same roof with my mother-in-law either, so I took my daughter back to my parents' house. I even considered renting a place because living with her had become unbearable. A few days later, Jack came over, looking troubled. He handed me 3 paternity test reports. The results showed that my daughter was indeed Jack's biological child. Jack was his father's biological son, and my daughter was biologically related to her grandfather. However, my daughter had no biological relation to my mother-in-law, which left me puzzled. I asked, Do you want to do a test with your mom? Jack frowned, clearly conflicted. How could my mom not be my mom? I couldn't understand it either. His father might not be his biological father, but he was definitely born from his mother. How could she not be his mother? I said, Maybe the paternity test with our daughter and her has an error. He nodded. I suspect that too. Before we could figure out how to tell his mom, she called, demanding, Where are the paternity test results? Have you got them yet? We have them, Jack replied. Why don't you dare show me? I was right, wasn't I? That child isn't yours. Her aggressive tone infuriated Jack. If she wants to see them, let her see them. We returned home, and Jack handed the reports to his mom. She looked at them repeatedly, unable to believe her eyes. How is this possible? It looks like you all are a family, and I'm the outsider. Jack suggested, Maybe the test with you and our daughter is wrong. She was stunned for a moment. How could only mine be wrong? I want to do a test with you. Jack couldn't argue with her and wanted to get to the bottom of it, so they went for a paternity test. When the results came back, my mother-in-law nearly collapsed. The report showed that Jack was not biologically related to her. She broke down in tears. How can this be? I carried you for 10 months. I had a difficult labor. I even heard the doctor ask your father whether to save me or the baby. We were both saved, and now you're not my son?" She fainted from the shock, and we rushed her to the hospital. While she was being treated, I looked at Jack's exhausted face and said, "I think there's a hidden secret about your birth. Maybe your mom doesn't know, but your dad might. Should we call him and ask?" Jack said, "Do you know what scares me? That I'm not their son. But you did a paternity test with your dad. You are his biological son." Jack looked confused. "Yes, I'm my dad's biological son. So why am I not my mom's?" He seemed lost in thought, unable to process everything. I said, "That's why we need to call your dad and ask him what's going on. Since you're his biological son, he must know the secret." Jack snapped out of it. "You're right, Dad must know. I'll call him." His father arrived quickly, and by then, my mother-in-law had been moved to a hospital room. She became agitated when she saw him. "Tell me, when I was pregnant, was I really pregnant? I wasn't faking it, right? When I gave birth, wasn't it a difficult labor? Didn't the doctor ask you whether to save me or the baby? Didn't I go through all that pain to give birth to Jack? How can he be your son but not mine?" Her husband tried to calm her. "Don't get worked up. Once you're better, I'll explain everything." "No, tell me now. I won't get better until you tell me," she insisted, struggling to breathe. He quickly reassured her. "All right, I'll tell you now." We all quieted down, eager to hear the truth. My heart was pounding with curiosity. He began, "We had an arranged marriage. My parents forced me to marry you. Before that, I had a girlfriend. When I told her we had to break up, she cried, and I was heartbroken too." I glanced at Jack, realizing how similar his situation was to his father's. Both had their relationships broken up by their parents. Jack had told me that his mother had been the one to break up his previous relationship, and his father couldn't stand up to her. Before we broke up, we had one last meal together and drank a lot. We both got drunk. When I woke up, she was gone. After marrying you, I tried to forget her and focus on our life together. You had a difficult pregnancy, and I saw how much you suffered. I vowed to take good care of you. When you went into labor, it was complicated. The doctor asked me whether to save you or the baby. I was in tears, begging the doctor to save both of you. The doctor said they would try, but that I had to choose. I chose to save you and signed the consent form. The waiting was agonizing. I was terrified something would happen to you. Later, the doctor came out and said the baby didn't make it and that you were in critical condition and needed to be monitored for 2 days. Those 2 days were hell. I couldn't sleep, haunted by the image of you pregnant. I couldn't bear the thought of you waking up to find out the baby was gone. Then I got a call from my ex-minds. She had just given birth to a baby, my baby, but she wasn't married and couldn't keep him. I realized that on the night we broke up, we had been together. She asked if I could take the baby. If I couldn't, she would give him up for adoption. Looking at you in the ICU, I thought this was a perfect solution. I could raise my biological son, and you wouldn't have to grieve the loss of our baby. So I accepted the baby from the incubator. My ex left, and when you woke up, you thought Jack was our son. We were all silent for a long time. I never imagined Jack's background was like this. He was equally stunned, sitting there in a daze. After a while, my mother-in-law started crying. "So, all these years I've been raising someone else's child?" My father-in-law said, "How can you say that? Jack has always called you mom and been so good to you. Even a biological child might not be as good." At that moment, I felt sorry for my mother-in-law. She had raised a child, believing he was her own, only to find out he wasn't. It must have been devastating. I signaled to Jack to comfort her, but he just sat there, lost in thought. After years of marriage, I knew him well. He tended to overthink things, analyzing every detail. He was probably still trying to understand why he wasn't his mother's son and who his biological mother was. This wasn't the right time to ask about his biological mother. My mother-in-law was already so upset. Bringing up his biological mother might push her over the edge. My father-in-law continued to comfort my mother-in-law, apologizing and explaining that he had no choice because her baby was stillborn. He had done it to spare her the pain, thinking the secret would stay hidden forever. But my mother-in-law's suspicions, triggered by our daughter's beauty, had brought the truth to light. After a long while, Jack finally snapped out of his daze and said to his mom, "Mom, don't overthink it. You're my only mom. Whether you accept me or not, I accept you. This brought her some comfort, and she started crying again. After that, we never spoke of the incident again, as if it had never happened. Once my mother in law was discharged from the hospital, our family life returned to its previous calm. My father in law continued living in his own place. I began to understand the root of their past arguments. My mother in law had always been jealous of my father in law's first love. Whenever he seemed lost in thought, she accused him of thinking about his ex, even though she had never met the woman or knew what she looked like. She had spent her life competing with an imagined rival. Our seemingly peaceful family life was actually quite strained. My mother in law was no longer domineering. Instead, she treated us like guests. Jack was also more formal with her, no longer speaking casually. The once close mother son relationship had become distant. It was almost comical to see them interact so cautiously, afraid to offend each other. I wondered if they would ever return to their previous closeness. I still had one unanswered question. Who was Jack's biological mother? I suspected Jack wanted to know too, but neither of us dared to ask. A few months later, the relationship between Jack and his mom began to thaw. They weren't as confrontational as before and started chatting more freely. One afternoon, I received a call from a middle school classmate saying our teacher was ill and wanted to see me. This classmate, the teacher's daughter, had been in my class and we were close. Our teacher never wanted to trouble her students, so we hadn't known she was sick. Now that she wanted to see me, her daughter called me. I went to the hospital and saw our teacher, frail and aged beyond her years. She was in her 50s but looked much older. I asked, "Oh dear, what's wrong? Why do you look so pale?" She smiled kindly and said, "It's nothing serious. I'm just worn out from worrying about the kids." She loved teaching and her students dearly. Over decades, she had taught countless students. We chatted about my daughter, who was now 4. I showed her pictures on my phone, and she smiled as she looked through them, tears silently streaming down her face. I felt a pang of sadness, unsure why the photos made her so emotional. I didn't dare ask or try to comfort her. I thought she might be reminiscing about our school days, especially since she had played a significant role in bringing Jack and me together. Although my mother-in-law had asked her to introduce us, she had genuinely wanted us to be happy. Unfortunately, she couldn't attend our wedding because she was away on a business trip. After looking at the photos, she wiped her tears and sighed, "I'm getting old. When I was your age, I wasn't even married. Now my child is as old as you, and I have grandchildren." Her husband had passed away, and she lived with her daughter. Despite her illness, they were a close-knit family. It was sad that she could no longer return to the classroom. As I was leaving, she said, "Come visit with Jack and your daughter this weekend." I promised we would and told her to take care. She insisted, "You must come. I'll be waiting for you." I realized she truly wanted to see us. When I told Jack about her illness, he was concerned and agreed we should visit her that weekend. On the weekend, we told my mother-in-law about the visit. She said, "I'll come with you. The teacher brought you two together, and now that your child is grown, I should thank her." At the hospital, my mother-in-law went to the bathroom while we went up to the room. We found our teacher staring out the window. She smiled when we greeted her. I placed our daughter on the bed, but she was hesitant, probably scared by my teacher's frail appearance. I told her, "This lady loves you very much. She cried when she saw your photos on my phone. Comfort her, okay?" My daughter, with her soft heart, held my teacher's hand and said, "Don't cry." My teacher smiled through her tears. "I won't cry. You're such a good girl." But she couldn't stop the tears from flowing. My daughter wiped them away and asked, "Does it hurt?" She shook her head, still smiling. "No, it doesn't hurt. I'm just happy to see you." She tried to comfort my daughter, but her tears wouldn't stop. She looked at my daughter and then at Jack, and her tears flowed even more. My heart ached. I turned around and saw my mother-in-law standing at the door. I went over to greet her, and she said, "I'll come in a bit later." Her eyes were red, and it looked like she was about to cry too. Jack was holding the teacher's hand, comforting her. "Don't worry. Take care of yourself. You'll get better." She nodded through her tears. Thank you for coming to see me." We stayed with her for over half an hour, but we didn't want to tire her out. so we said our goodbyes. As we reached the elevator, my father in law and mother in law stepped out. My father in law asked, "How is your teacher?" Jack replied, "She's quite ill." "If she's so ill, why aren't you staying to take care of her?" "Her daughter is with her." I noticed my father in law's eyes were red, and suddenly, everything clicked. My middle school teacher was my real mother in law, Jack's biological mother, and my father in law's first girlfriend. Jack stood there, still clueless, looking at his parents. I nudged him and said, "Let's go back to the teacher's room." Jack went in alone. Through the glass door, I saw him holding my teacher's hand, crying uncontrollably. I started crying too, and so did my in-laws. Not long after, my teacher passed away peacefully. It took us about 6 months to recover from the grief. During Christmas, we all sat together for a family dinner. My mother-in-law raised her glass to my daughter and said, "Come here, my dear granddaughter. I owe you an apology. I'm sorry." My daughter, holding her juice, giggled and said, "Cheers, Grandma." My mother-in-law then apologized to me and Jack. After dinner, we sat down to watch TV and chat. Suddenly, my father-in-law looked at my mother-in-law and said, "There's something I've never understood. Can you explain it to me?" "What is it? Go ahead." "We've been married for decades, and you've always been jealous, always arguing with me. If I talked to a neighbor for a bit, you'd start a fight. But that day at the hospital, why did you come to me and ask me to see the teacher?" My mother-in-law sighed and said, "I guess deep down I always knew. I knew she was your first girlfriend, and I knew Jack was her son. I just didn't want to admit it. But when I saw how much she cared for our family, I realized she wasn't a threat. She was just a mother who wanted the best for her child, just like me." My father-in-law nodded, tears in his eyes. "Thank you for understanding." We all sat there, the weight of the past lifting off our shoulders, finally finding peace in the truth. My mother-in-law sighed and said, "When I was younger, I was hot-headed and didn't like you getting too close to other women. I always felt like everyone was trying to take my man. After our son started school, the only woman I ever admired was her. She wasn't just good to Jack, she was good to every student. I used to treat her like a close friend, telling her everything, how you made me angry, how our son wouldn't listen. She had a way of comforting people that always made me feel better. But I never realized that the man I complained about was her true love, and the son I complained about was her biological son. That day, when I saw her holding Jack's hand and crying, I noticed the similarities in their features and suddenly understood that Jack must be her son. She must have known all along that Jack was her biological son, but she never disrupted our lives or tried to reconnect with him. Can you imagine how great a woman she was? If it were me, I wouldn't have been able to hold back. I would have done everything to hear my son call me mom. But she never said a word, even when she was gravely ill. Thinking from her perspective, I felt a deep sorrow. I couldn't let her leave with regrets, and I couldn't let Jack live with the lifelong regret of not having honored his biological mother. So, I called you. Her words brought tears to our eyes. Despite her many flaws, she was fundamentally kind-hearted. It was her kindness that ensured there were no regrets between my husband and his biological mother. Her kindness also earned the respect of my father-in-law and my husband. My father-in-law moved back in with my mother-in-law, and they rented out his place. Our family life returned to its usual rhythm, filled with the familiar bickering and banter. This was the symphony of a normal family, and in the end, we were all happy together.